Hi everybody, it's Dan. Welcome back and welcome to another Let's Paint video, this time for the Victrix Rust figures that you will have seen me starting to paint if you watched my paint and chat kind of ramble video from last month. The format for this one's going to be a little unusual as well, in that whereas I normally will go through, do the footage first, edit it down, and then do a voiceover, I'm going to try my hand at commentating while painting. This is something I struggled with early on in the channel. It's why I adopted the voiceover format, because I really found it difficult to multitask the narration and painting at the same time. But with experience, I feel I'm a little bit better at that now, and that format will allow me to point out some nuance to what I'm doing and add in some more insights that I feel sometimes get lost, because with the voiceover format, I'm sometimes kind of stumbling over myself. I feel a little bit rushed because the footage is changing even if I'm mid-sentence. So this will allow me, I think, to give you some better detail on what it is I'm doing, and if you wanted to try this for yourself, what you should do as well. There is going to be heavy editing. Like I'm going to cut out all the silence, so you're not just watching me paint a model. But there, I believe, it'll be a longer video than we're normally accustomed to, simply because I'll have probably more to say. So without further ado, again, this is a Victrix Rust model, just out of the box. It's mounted on a 25mm square base. And sometimes I'll cut them off, like I'll cut off the splash base that they come on, just to make it more flush with the base. Sometimes I'll even mix and match that within a unit just to give them slightly varied heights too, so I find that useful. But as you can see, in this particular case, I just shaved it down a little bit on the one side to get it to accommodate the 25mm square, and I think it fits quite nicely. The only other thing I've done here, I alluded to this in that paint and chat video, is that I went through and applied a layer of Flesh Terror's red contrast paint to the armor bits. You can see there's quite a bit of what I would call like lacquer or lamellar armor, which is going to be a unifying theme for this unit. And I've already just applied one thin layer of that, and we'll talk a little bit toward the end of the video about how I'm going to handle that, because I want it to have like a nice shiny effect like we did with the Ashigaru that I did a couple months ago. But we're going to try something slightly different on this one. So that's all I've done, and then what I'm going to do now is go in and start working on the chainmail bits, for which I'm going to use Iron Warriors from Citadel. This is a really nice dark silver color, which I like because I like to do some nice bright like dry brush highlights on the figure, and that allows it to have quite a bit of contrast. So this has kind of been my go-to, especially for like Dark Age and medieval models. I get questions too about thinning my paints down. I do already in the pot. Everything is slightly thinned down just with water, but I'm also just constantly dipping my brush in water, which you may hear some chiming of in the background. And you can get to a point where you can kind of see the consistency on the brush if it's what you want it to be. There's actually not as much metal bits on this figure as I'm used to normally with Dark Age figures, because so much of the metal portions are going to be this red color. I mentioned too I'd been agonizing over what to do with these shields, and in the end I'm actually going to paint them white with a kind of dark red motif as another unifying factor for the unit. These are going to be Varangians, I don't know how you pronounce it, but I wanted them to have a slightly more uniform look than my rank and file guys. And since I have Yams Vikings that have black shields with a red emblem, I thought we might in this case go with white shields with a red emblem. So I am doing the outline of the metal. I'm probably gonna have to come back and clean that up in the end, but for now I'm just trying to kind of block in some of this color, even though I know, even like with painting the back of the shield, for example, I'm gonna mess that metal part up, but it provides a nice foundation color that you can then clean up later. Next here I'm doing Retributor armor, which is a very nice bright Citadel gold color. And I use probably more gold than your historical gamer might, because I use almost all of my historical figures in fantasy wargaming, and I find gold is a really nice general contrasting color that works well for trim, And as I said, as another point of unification for a unit to have, everybody's got some gold accents. It's also a really easy way to signify that a unit is intended to be an elite unit if it's got a high amount of gold on the figure. So I'm picking out basically everything that looks like it could be gold trim. The helmet here is pretty obvious. And then even the male skirt, I'm going to go through and pick out in gold. And the bulk of my silver highlights are actually going to come after the figure has had a wash. But as just like a preliminary step here, I'm coming in with Army Painter's Shining Silver, which is a very nice bright silver color, and giving all the silver and gold bits a nice light dry brush of silver. See, that's too much there. But you want to give it a nice light dry brush of silver just to brighten it up a little bit. And as I mentioned, we're going to then come back after the wash to boost it up with some true highlights. And at this stage, I'm not deliberately hitting the lamellar pieces, the red armor. But if you do hit it, it's not a big deal. They'll just end up looking kind of like scratches or scuffs. So this will be the first color that is diluted with a little bit of thinning medium. If you don't have this, I recommend you pick some up. It's Vallejo thinning medium, and you can use it even if you're not taking it to an extreme like I am, just to routinely thin your paints down. It's much better than water, flows much better, and then suspends the color better. It's something I'll never turn back from using. But what I've done here is done, I guess, a little bit less than a 50-50 ratio of, in this case, Xandri dust, which is my go-to wood grain color, and some of this thinning medium. And you'll know the consistency is right. If you can see, it's kind of, maybe you can't see it in the camera, but it's kind of turning a like pale gray color. And that means that it's going to be nice and thin, which I want for this, especially wood grain, because I want it to almost go on like a wash, not quite as thin as that, but you'll see here that when I apply it, it's going to run more like a contrast paint than like a layer paint. You can see there, you can kind of play with it, move it around, but what I want it to do is naturally leave some lighter areas toward the upper part of, in this case, the axe shaft. So it's gonna, much like a contrast paint, just not having as extreme low light areas, it's gonna flow on whatever surface you're applying it to, and then create some natural shading, which we're then going to boost up with a very light, very, very light white dry brush step, and then wash it. So it sounds like a lot if you've not seen any of my Let's Paint videos. Seems kind of convoluted at this stage, but if you want to think about it this way, it's kind of like the Army Painter dip method. We're just going to do a like pre-highlight step. So that's all we're going to end up doing here. And I think the end result's pretty cool, but you can see the way that it's flowing, again, is much more like a contrast paint with this thinning medium on there. So it's going to create some naturally lighter areas that will be left behind with a wash step. And again, we're going to boost those up with a dry brush. So I'm painting the axe shaft, the hilt of the sword, and then the back of the shield, best as you can. Now we're picking out the skin. There's not a whole lot of skin on these figures. This is also thinned down with that Vallejo medium. This is Two Thin Coats Dwarf Flesh, which I find, despite the name, is actually great for all human flesh as like a base layer, which we can then boost up with some brighter colors, but it has excellent coverage. And as I said, it's a nice kind of rich tan skin color, which works well with a lot of highlight colors that I've found. So most of these models, it's just the hands that are going to need to be picked out, but some of them, like this one, are worth kind of going in and picking out the eyes. And it's not a huge deal if you clip the silver here, like I've done, because we can, again, clean that up at the highlight step. So here's the fun part. I could go with like a uniform color, but I thought they all might look too samey if they've got the same armor, same shield, and the same cloth. So what I'm doing here is I'm going through with, I have tons and tons of like browns and neutral kind of tan colors in my collection because I do so much Dark Age and medieval painting. So it's quite handy to have maybe like a quarter of my paint collection be neutral colors like that to lean on for all kinds of different cloth colors. So what I'm going with here is Ushabti Bone, once again with a little bit of that Vallejo thinning medium in there. to an almost 50-50 ratio to turn it into kind of like a contrast paint. So I'm going to go through and I'll paint the tunic in that color. And this is much more handy if you're doing this in assembly line style. Right now I'm doing this model as a one-off just for demonstration purposes, but this kind of technique is much easier if you've got a line of models, because you can then pick one color and do like tunic, pant, because that's most of these figures are broken up between a tunic or a shirt of some kind that will need a color, and then a pant. So it's easier if you just kind of follow a pattern like that, like tunic, pant, and then for whatever next color you pick, do like pant, tunic, right? Just moving down the line, then you kind of jumble them up and then do it again. And in that way, you'll end up with a lot of different variations of color and combinations of color. So as I said, I'm doing a Shabti bone for the tunic, and then for the pant, I'm going to go through, and in this case, I'm using Gorthor fur. It's something between like scorched earth and bestial brown. I'm not quite sure what to call it. This is also thinned down with a little bit of that Vallejo medium, and you can see here, this is a really good example of what I'm talking about, where it's leaving behind in the upper areas of the model, it's leaving behind almost like tinted white pigment, and that's good. We want that. It's all kind of a balancing act, I suppose, but that will allow us to, much like a contrast paint, just kind of boost it up a little bit, and then once we wash it down, that will darken the recesses even further. So that's kind of the game we're playing here. For my leather colors, I like to use a mix of different shades. Typically like Doombull Brown, Dryad Bark are some go-tos for me, and I find that mixing them up, even on a single model, is a good way to convey, not randomness, but that, you know, this is a non-uniform army. And in this particular case, I've even gone so far as to mix some of that Dryad Bark color in with my original mixture that I was just using for the tunic of Ushabti bone and a little bit of Gorthor fur. So that's one beauty of this, because we're constantly mixing paints up. It allows you to create a lot of variation within a unit without really wasting any paint. So what I might do again, like in an assembly line format, is I might go through with one color, call it Dryad Bark, and apply it to things like the sword scabbard, maybe the belts, and then I would go through with Doombull Brown and then paint the shoes on that figure. You know, you kind of mix and match what part of the model is getting painted with what color, so that it's not like everybody's got Doombull Brown shoes and everybody's got scorched brown or Dryad Bark sword scabbards. But I like those two colors because they're nice, rich, dark brown colors that have great application. Doombull Brown I would use more sparingly on a figure like this, where it has lots of red, because Doombull Brown has red in it naturally, or it's a red tinted brown color. So I'd be more inclined to stick more to the like darker tones that are on this figure. But even here, just on my palette, again, I've just got some paints already sitting there. So I'm gonna go through here, and like this little pouch has now got like a slightly yellow tint to it. So as I said, you can kind of just play around with it that way. I might even just use that same color I've got on my brush for the shoes. Once again, still kind of thinned down. You can see it on the splash base there, how it goes out. And that's going to create a natural bit of shading. Well, I shouldn't say shading, because it's the opposite. It's like leaving behind highlights that we're going to be able to then boost up.
So now we're onto the shield, and it's actually pretty unusual for me to be painting pure white when I'm dealing with a white surface. Usually I'm using an off-white color, but as this is a shield, it's a flat surface, there's not going to be a whole lot of variation in color. Like, I'm not looking for any highlights here, and so I'm going to use just pure white as a base color for the shield design that I'm going for. It might seem kind of asinine to go through and paint a white surface. I primed the figure in white, but to paint a white surface in white. But this is just to ensure that the color is uniform, because when we're freehanding designs, as I'm going to do here, it's important that you have a consistent base color to work with, because there's going to be a lot of, or I should say some, seesawing between colors. That's kind of the trick with any kind of freehand work, is that you're going to actually hop back and forth between whatever the motif color is and the base color. So while the shield is drying, before I apply the freehand work, I'm going to go through and do my dry brush step here. This is an optional step. You could, in theory, just wash the figure here, but I like to go through and do a little boost of a highlight color, usually just pure white, in order to kind of bring up the highlights before we darken them way down with a heavy wash. I have a couple now of different makeup brushes, or what I use for all my dry brush work, of different sizes. So because on this model we're not going to be hitting a lot like of the metal areas or even really the red, I'm going to go with a smaller dry brush this time. But I'm using just pure white, the same pure white that I use for the back of the shield. You want to make sure most of it's off, because as I said, this is going to be a very, very light dry brush step. And I can usually tell if I just use like my thumbnail there to see how much is on the brush, make sure that there's no streaks, because that's the most important part here, is that this is supposed to create the illusion of a very faint highlight of whatever color you're hitting. And if you create streaks of white because there's too much white on your brush, you can see there, maybe it's not even coming out on the camera, I don't know, but it's just slightly brightening whatever color we're hitting here. And I say all the time, less is more. You can build the color up. But really, I'm just going after the cloth, I'm going after the skin, I'm going after some of these areas like on the sword scabbard, shoes. It's not a big deal if you hit the red, I'm just not deliberately targeting it. And then you're going to go through and pick out some of these areas, some of these upper areas, with just a tiny, tiny little dot of pure white. You see how small that is? Like it's barely perceptible. And you want to be super sparing with this, really only the areas you're kind of using your dry brush step as a guide for where to place these highlights. But they're just tiny little dots that you want to place in some areas on the figure. Again, ignore the red, ignore the metal. We're just focusing on the cloth and on the skin here. And what that will do, I say all the time, it looks kind of silly right now, kind of cartoonish, but this is going to really up the contrast on the figure. And then once we wash it, it's going to kind of blend these colors all together so they look less outlandish. As I said, this is a purely optional step, though. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Now let's get back to this shield. So I mentioned I wanted to do some freehand work here. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for the shield for quite a while, but I've settled on a chi rho, which is, whether historically correct or not, a symbol that was used by the Byzantine army after Constantine I, so a few hundred years before what I'm trying to depict here. But it's essentially a combination of the Greek letters chi, which I think is the X, and rho, forgive my pronunciation, which is the P. And as I said, this was a symbol of or at least used by the late Romans and the Byzantines. As to whether or not the Varangians would have actually used it, I don't know. But I thought it looked kind of cool. So I'm just kind of framing out the rough shape of it. Again, I'm not super worried about tightening up edges, but actually I'm doing a better job than I normally do. So I'm using the boss of the shield as the center point. So I've done my P symbol there. And I'm going to come through and do my X now. And again, you want to stencil out the lines. You can always come back and thicken them if you want to. But all we're really trying to do is mock up the framework for it. So you want to follow the line from the other side, as I'm doing here. So I'm following this line. Try to keep it about the same length. And then same thing here. So I want to follow this line. And then I want to square them off here. So from here you can then thicken it as much as you want. I actually like that just fine for this figure. I don't need to be much bolder than that, but I sometimes will vary it up from shield to shield, especially with these Dark Age figures, where I want the motif to be uniform. I don't want it to be identical, like it was mass-produced in a shop. So some of them will be thicker, some of them will be thinner. Sometimes the design will be smaller or larger, just depending on the figure, but in this case I'm just going over to make sure that the symbol is nice and opaque looking. And again, don't worry about smudging or anything at this stage, because then what you're going to do is you're going to go back to that original white color that we had applied as a base, and you want to make sure you get all the red paint out of your brush, otherwise you'll end up with pink. So I'm going to take this white color and I'm now going to come back and cut in against the red that I just put down. So again, I am just trying to tighten everything up, sharpen the edges, and as I said, I actually did a better job than I normally do. This is also a good way to like pre-weather a shield. You can create like chipping effects on paint and shields by just like intentionally kind of cutting in against it like this to make it look kind of worn or like it's been dinged. But my main focus here is I'm just trying to square everything off, tighten up the designs. And if you want at this stage, like if you feel you need to go back in with the red, you absolutely can. I'd mentioned in my checkered shield design video, that's what you're essentially doing, is you just keep going back and forth until you get it the way that you like it. So I got the symbol mostly the way that I like it. What I'm going to do here is a pre-weathering step is I'm going to take a little bit of a dark brown color. I'm using just dryad bark still because I already had it out. I'm taking my dry brush that I used earlier, and I'm just stippling a little bit of brown on it. And ideally, if you had any of that like foam material that comes in blister packs, that actually works best for this. But you can be sparing with it. Again, you're just trying to create some scuffs, and you can, take some of that brown and just stencil in some sword strikes, some dings and dents. You can get as crazy with it as you want, but that's pretty much all I'm looking to do, is just create some visual interest to break up all the flat areas on the shield. So this is my favorite part, and I'll say here again too that this started with Army Painter dip, like quick shade is how I started this method. So I definitely recommend that if you've got it laying around. The issue with it is I've found it's really not worth busting it out unless you're doing large batches of models at a time. Like for me, it was like anything less than 60 models, it just felt like a waste of time. So that's why I started using just regular acrylic washes. If you have enamel or oil washes, I think that would work here just fine too, but I don't have a lot of experience with that outside of, as I mentioned, the Army Painter Quick Shade, which I think is just an oil wash. It's just like wood stain. But anyway, I'm going to be using some acrylic washes here. I'm actually using two this time. It says Seraphim Sepia here, but it's actually a mix of mostly Agrex or shade and then some other like dark tones. And then I'm also going to trial out some light tone for the white portion of the shield, which is something I've been meaning to test out, so we'll see how that works together. But you're going to take a nice hefty amount of this stuff. And normally I would say you're like bathing the entirety of the model, but in this case you're going to be a little bit more tactical, because I don't want the red to get hit with this, and I don't want the shield to get hit with it. So I'm going to kind of go through again more carefully, and as I said, it's not a big deal if you do hit the red, you just don't want to like douse it, because I've found with the Ashigaru that we tested out this technique on, that the armor ended up being much darker than I wanted it to be. And I think that's because I used a contrast paint which already has some natural shading in it. So we can ignore the shading step with it and just skip right to the highlights, or in this case the varnish is what we're gonna end up using. So otherwise I'm hitting everything with a nice heavy wash. And if you notice that it's pooling, like it's starting to pool here, like on the clothing, you can kind of wick it away, try to shift it elsewhere. That's all you want to make sure doesn't happen, is that it doesn't pool anywhere that it shouldn't, because it won't dry right. Alright, let's try out some of this Army Painter light tone. And what I normally do is that is nice. I'll normally water down some Agrex or a shade. But all I'm doing here is just using out of the pot light tone. And you can see it's almost got like a sepia finish to it. So I'm not going to like cover the entire shield. I'm mostly just hitting the rim of it and the boss, like you see there. And I'm gonna try to wick away some of this just so that it doesn't create like an even line around the outside of the shield. Because I don't want this to look like clean white. It's not supposed to be a clean white surface. It's just supposed to be a brighter surface. And actually that dries quite nicely. I'm kind of changing my mind here mid-tutorial. I'm going to try this out on this armor just to create a little bit more shading. Again, I'm now putting the soft tone or light tone, whatever they call it, over the red, and we'll see how it dries. So you can theoretically be done here. Just give it a matte varnish, and then we'll do a gloss varnish on the armor. But I do like to do, I keep using the word tactical, but I use the term tactical highlights to refer to the fact that there's certain areas on a model that I think pop at the tabletop level if you just take a little bit of extra time to highlight them up, and those are anything with skin or armor, like metallic areas. So I think if you brighten those areas up, also like white, if you have white cloth, that part's important too. But since we don't have any of that on this model, I'm going to go through, I'm using Luminous Flesh from AK Acrylics here, and I'm just going to pick out some areas here that I want to brighten up. Again, you want to be sparing with it, just like with those dot highlights, and you're almost in some areas going over the dot highlights. It's not a big deal. It's just a matter of you're just trying to, again, increase the contrast on the figure. Then I'm doing the same thing with my metals. I'm going back to that same Army Painter shining silver metal color. So I want to come through, the silver already had a dry brush of this color before, so it's creating some gradient that we can then kind of work with. But you're really just picking out upper areas, things that look like light would be glinting off of, and being sparing, because contrast is the name of the game here. So you gotta have dark areas for the light areas to work. I think I'm quoting Bob Ross on that one. And you can see on the back rim of the shield here, I'm going in kind of an irregular pattern, because when you do that, you can see like it almost creates the illusion of it being an irregular shape, like it's been dented or dinged up. So that also helps sell the idea of battle damage. And then you can also highlight up your gold with the silver color. You just want to be really sparing with it. Now we're using some out of the pot Citadel Ard Coat. And you want to use a detail brush for this, because I don't want it spilling out on anything that's not red. So I'm just going to come through, we're going to do 2 thin coats of this, because if you do a thick coat, it's going to not dry correctly. It'll have like a crackling effect. But just nice thin coats. And we're going to then, in building it up that way, create hopefully the effect of some lacquer armor. But as I said, just sticking to the red areas. There's a good argument you should do it the other way, but what I'm now doing is coming through with Army Painter matte varnish and hitting everything that isn't metal and that isn't that lacquer color. So this is a good opportunity to then, if you hit anything you didn't intend to with that Ard coat, you can come through and do some thin coats of matte varnish over it. But this is an important step even if you're not using Ard coat, that if anytime you do a heavy wash, certainly if you're using like Army Painter dip, they're quick shades, you definitely have to have a matte varnish. But I think a matte varnish looks good even just for regular washes, because it really helps to blend together the colors, I find. I don't know quite why, but the end result's quite nice. Again, this is totally optional, but I like to do a little bit of blood effects on my dark age models. I actually have a whole separate tutorial on this, how to do like splatter effects and stuff, but and there you have it. So base them up, do that, in this case 29 more times, and through the magic of editing I can show you that the finished unit now looks like this. So yeah, I think they turned out pretty cool. I have tutorials on how to do the banners, how to do all the basing, if that's something that you'd like to learn how to do, I'll have links down in the description to those videos. So yeah, I'm really pleased with these models. The figures look fantastic. Victrix really knocked it out of the park with these guys. And I'm excited to dig into some more Dark Aging. It's got plenty more to come. Let me know down below if you like this format better than my voiceover format that I had been doing. It's equally easy for me to do either. But hopefully you enjoyed this one. But regardless, I appreciate you dropping by for this one. And until next time, happy gaming.